The sun hung low over the desert valley, a blood-red orb bleeding into the horizon. The air was thick with heat, the kind that clung to the skin and baked the earth until it cracked like old leather. Elias Kane rode slow atop his dun mare, dust, her hooves kicking up clouds of grit that shimmered in the dying light. His hat, weathered and stained, cast a shadow over eyes that had seen too much, eyes that carried the weight of a man who'd outlived his own heart. The year was 1878, and the frontier was a land of ghosts, where dreams went to die under the relentless sun. Elias was no stranger to this desolation. At 38, he was a man carved from the rawhide of the West Broad shoulders, hands calloused from years gripping reins and revolvers, a face etched with scars that told stories he'd rather forget. His duster, frayed at the hem, flapped against his boots as dust plodded toward Red Hollow, a speck of a town nestled in the crook of the valley. He needed supplies, nails, flour, maybe a bottle of whiskey to dull the ache of memory. His ranch, a crumbling relic 5 miles out, was all he had left, though it was more ruin than home. The barn leaned like a drunkard, the fields were barren, and the ghosts of his past whispered in every creak of the floorboards. Red Hollow came into view, its wooden buildings hunched against the wind. The saloon's sign swung lazily, its paint chipped to near illegibility. Elias tethered dust to a post outside the general store, ignoring the wary glances from townsfolk who knew his name. Once, he'd been a gunslinger, a shadow who rode with men like Caleb Voss, men who carved their names in blood. But that was another life, before the fire that took his wife, Sarah, and their boy, Jonah, before betrayal turned his heart to ash. Inside the store, the air smelled of dust and tobacco. Old man Harper, the storekeeper, squinted at Elias over wire-rimmed glasses. "Kane," he said, voice gruff. "Heard you're still holed up in that wreck you call a ranch." "Need nails," Elias replied, his voice low, like gravel underfoot. "And flour. Whatever you got." Harper nodded, shuffling to the shelves. "Trouble's brewin', you know. Voss's gang's been hittin' the tribes hard. I'd seen a village up north. Burned a family's hut last week for refusing to pay their toll." Elias's jaw tightened. Caleb Voss. The name was a blade in his gut. Years ago, they'd ridden together, partners in a world where loyalty was a lie. Voss had turned on him during a botched robbery, leaving Elias for dead while flames swallowed his home. Elias had clawed his way back from that betrayal, but the cost was everything he loved. He said nothing, tossing coins on the counter as Harper bagged his goods. "Stay clear of it, Kane," Harper warned. "Voss ain't the man you knew. He's worse." Elias tipped his hat and stepped back into the heat. The weight of his Colt revolver at his hip was a cold comfort. He loaded the supplies onto dust, his mind wrestling with Harper's words. Voss was a shadow from his past, one he'd tried to bury. But the desert had a way of unearthing things best left dead. As he rode out of Red Hollow, the sky darkened, the sun now a thin sliver above the horizon. The trail to his ranch wound through scrub and cactus, the silence broken only by dust's steady hoofbeats. Then he saw a plume of smoke rising from the north, black and thick against the twilight. His gut twisted. The Atsina village. Harper's warning echoed, but so did something deeper, a pull he couldn't name. He spurred dust forward, the mare snorting as she broke into a gallop. The village came into view, a cluster of hide tents and adobe huts nestled against a dry riverbed. Flames licked the sky, devouring a hut at the edge of the settlement. Shouts filled the air, sharp and desperate, in a tongue Elias didn't know. Figures moved in the chaos, women clutching children, men wielding spears, their faces painted with fear and fury. Elias slid from Dust's saddle, his hand on his revolver, scanning for Voss's men, but the attackers were gone, leaving only fire and ruin in their wake. A cry pierced the din, a child's scream, raw and terrified, from inside the burning hut. Elias's heart lurched. He saw Jonah in his mind's eye, small and laughing, before the flames took him. Without thinking, he ran toward the hut, heat blasting his face as he neared. The roof sagged, embers raining down like hell's confetti. He tore his bandana from his neck, tying it over his mouth, and plunged inside. Smoke choked his lungs, stinging his eyes. The heat was a living thing, clawing at his skin. He dropped to his knees, crawling through the haze, following the sound of the child's sobs. There, in a corner, a boy no older than 8 cowered, his dark eyes wide with terror. His clothes were singed, his face streaked with soot. Elias scooped him up, the boy's small frame trembling against his chest. "Hold on, kid," he rasped, voice muffled through the bandana. The roof groaned, a beam crashing behind them. Elias stumbled toward the door, shielding the boy as sparks bit into his back. He burst into the open air, collapsing to his knees. The boy still clutched tight. The villagers surrounded him, their voices a mix of relief and suspicion. A woman, her face lined with worry, rushed forward, prying the boy from Elias's arms. She spoke rapidly in her language, tears streaming as she held the child close. Elias coughed, the taste of smoke thick on his tongue. He stood, swaying, as an older woman approached, her presence commanding despite her small stature. Her hair was streaked with gray, her eyes sharp as flint. "You are not one of us," she said in halting English. "Yet you risked your life for Tala." "Why?" Elias wiped soot from his face, meeting her gaze. "Didn't have a choice," he said simply. It wasn't the whole truth, but it was close enough. He saw Jonah again, in the boy's frightened eyes, and the memory was a weight he couldn't shake. "I am Noya, elder of the Atsina," the woman said. "You have our gratitude, stranger, but you carry a shadow. We see it in your eyes." Elias didn't answer. He turned to dust, ready to ride back to his solitude, but Noya's voice stopped him. "Night falls. The desert is no place for a man alone. Stay with us until dawn." He hesitated. The Atsina watched him, some with gratitude, others with distrust. The boy, Tala, clung to his mother, staring at Elias with a mix of awe and fear. The fire still burned, its crackle a grim reminder of Voss's cruelty. Elias knew he should leave, keep his distance, let the past stay buried. But the boy's face, the weight of his own ghosts, held him there. "Till dawn," he said finally, nodding to Noya. She gestured to a tent, and the villagers parted to let him pass. As he followed, the weight of their eyes pressed against him, a stranger in a world not his own. The smoke lingered in the air, a promise of trouble yet to come. Somewhere out there, Caleb Voss was watching, waiting, and Elias Kane, whether he wanted it or not, had just stepped into the fire. The dawn broke over the Atsina village, a thin line of gold slicing through the indigo sky. Elias Kane stood at the edge of the camp, his breath visible in the chill of the desert morning. The fire from the night before had died to smoldering embers, but the acrid scent of charred wood lingered, a bitter reminder of the chaos he'd stumbled into. Dust, his mare, snorted softly as he tightened her saddle, her dark eyes watching him with a patience he envied. Elias's hands moved mechanically, but his mind was a storm memories of fire, betrayal, and a boy's terrified face swirled like dust in the wind. Noya, the Atsina elder, approached, her woven shawl drawn tight against the cold. Behind her stood a young warrior, tall and lean, his dark hair tied back with a leather cord. His eyes, sharp as a hawk's, studied Elias with guarded respect. "This is Kael," Noya said, her voice steady. "My son, he speaks your tongue better than I. He will guide you back to your path." Elias nodded, though he felt the weight of their scrutiny. "Obliged," he said, tipping his hat. "I'll be on my way." But Tala, the boy he'd saved, darted from a nearby tent, his small feet kicking up sand. He stopped short of Elias, clutching a carved stone in his hands, a crude likeness of a horse. "For you," Tala said, his voice barely above a whisper. His mother, hovering nearby, gave Elias a nod of gratitude. Elias took the stone, its weight grounding him for a moment. He saw Jonah in Tala's wide eyes, the son he'd lost to flames years ago. "Thank you, kid," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. He tucked the stone into his duster pocket, a small anchor against the tide of his past. Kael stepped forward. "The men who burned our home, they serve a man called Voss. They demand tribute, or they destroy. We owe you for Tala, but we do not trust easily." Elias's gut twisted at Voss's name. "Caleb Voss," he said, the words bitter on his tongue. "I know him." Noya's eyes narrowed. "You know this man? Then you know his cruelty." "More than you think," Elias replied, his hand brushing the grip of his Colt. He didn't elaborate. The memory of Voss's betrayal was a wound that never closed 10 years ago, a robbery gone wrong, Voss's knife in his back, and the fire that consumed Sarah and Jonah while Elias lay bleeding in the dirt. He'd survived, but at a cost no man should pay. Ride safe, Elias Kane, Noya said, as if sensing the shadow over him. The desert does not forgive. He mounted dust and rode south, the Atsina village fading into the haze. The trail to his ranch was a familiar one, winding through jagged rocks and thorny scrub. But as he crested a low rise, his heart sank. Smoke rose from his land, not the thick black of a fresh fire, but the gray wisps of ruin. He spurred dust into a gallop, dread coiling in his chest. His ranch came into view, or what was left of it. The barn, already half collapsed from years of neglect, was now a pile of splintered wood and ash. The fence was torn down, the ground scarred with hoofprints. Scrawled in charcoal on a broken plank was a message: "Pay or burn, Kane. Voss's work." Elias dismounted, his boots crunching on charred debris. The barn had been his last tether to the life he'd once dreamed of, a life with Sarah, with Jonah, with fields green and a home warm. Now it was gone. Another piece of him stolen by the man who'd already taken everything. He knelt, sifting through the ashes, his fingers closing around a rusted horseshoe. Jonah's favorite, the one he'd played with as a boy. The weight of it nearly broke him. He stood, jaw clenched, and scanned the horizon. Voss was out there, laughing, thinking he'd won. Elias's hand twitched toward his revolver, the urge for vengeance afire in his veins. But he stopped. Killing Voss wouldn't bring back the barn, wouldn't bring back his family. It wouldn't fill the hole in his chest. The sound of hoofbeats snapped him from his thoughts. He drew his Colt, ready for Voss's men. But it was KL, riding with 3 other Atsina warriors. Their horses were laden with tools, hammers, axes, lengths of rope. KL dismounted, his expression unreadable. "Noya sent us," he said. "You saved Tala. We will rebuild what was taken." Elias lowered his gun, suspicion warring with surprise. "Why? You don't owe me this." Kale's gaze was steady. "We pay our debts, and we know loss, as you do." Elias studied the warriors, their faces weathered by sun and hardship. He wanted to refuse, to send them back, to keep his solitude intact. But the sight of the ruined barn, the horseshoe still in his hand, softened something in him. "All right," he said finally, "but I work with you. This is my land." Kale nodded, a faint smile breaking his stoic mask. "Then, we begin." The day stretched long, the sun climbing high as they cleared the wreckage. Elias worked alongside the Atsina, hauling timber and hammering stakes, his muscles aching but his mind quiet for the first time in years. Kale was a man of few words, but his strength and precision spoke of a life forged in struggle. The other warriors, silent at first, began to share stories in halting English of hunts, of battles, of a land stolen piece by piece. Elias listened, saying little, but their words stirred something in him, a sense of kinship he hadn't felt since before the fire. As dusk fell, the skeleton of a new barn took shape, its frame stark against the reddening sky. They sat around a small fire, sharing dried meat and water from a canteen. Kale broke the silence. "Voss came to our village months ago, demanded half our harvest. When we refused, he burned Tala's home. He will not stop." Elias stared into the flames, the name Voss like a brand on his soul. "He was my partner once," he said, the words heavy. "We rode together. Robbed a stagecoach. He turned on me, left me for dead. My family paid the price." Kale's eyes softened, though his voice remained firm. "Then you understand why he must be stopped?" Elias nodded, but his heart was torn. Vengeance called to him, a siren's song promising release. Yet the work of the day, the Atsina's quiet generosity, pulled him another way. He thought of Tala, of the stone horse in his pocket. "I'll help you," he said at last. "But not for blood, for Tala, for your people." Kale extended a hand, and Elias clasped it, the grip strong and sure. The fire crackled, its light dancing on their faces, a fragile truce forged in the ashes of loss. But as night settled over the ranch, a distant howl broke the silence, not a coyote, but the low whistle of a man signaling trouble. Elias stood, his hand on his Colt, scanning the darkness. Kale and the warriors rose, their spears glinting in the firelight. "Voss's men," Kale said, his voice low. "They watch us." Elias's eyes narrowed, the weight of the past and the promise of the future colliding. The barn's frame loomed behind them, a symbol of what could be rebuilt, but also of what could be lost again. He tightened his grip on the revolver, knowing the path ahead would be paved with more than sweat and wood. The desert was awake, and Caleb Voss was coming. The desert stretched endless before Elias Kane, a sea of sand and stone baked to a cruel shimmer under the midday sun. Dust, his mare, plodded beside Cale's sturdy pinto, their hooves sinking into the soft earth with each step. The air was a furnace, searing Elias's lungs with every breath, his duster heavy with sweat and grit. His hat cast a meager shadow over his scarred face, but it did little to shield him from the heat that seemed to pulse from the ground itself. Cale rode beside him, his posture rigid, his eyes scanning the horizon like a hawk searching for prey. The Yatsina warrior carried a spear across his back, its tip glinting in the harsh light, a reminder of the danger they chased. 2 days had passed since the Yatsina began rebuilding Elias's barn, a gesture that had cracked the walls around his heart. But the whistle in the night, the signal of Voss's men watching from the shadows, had lit a fire under them. Red Hollow's bank was Voss's next target. Cale had learned from a scout, a heist meant to cripple the town and tighten his grip on the valley. Elias and Cale had set out at dawn, leaving the warriors to guard the ranch. Their mission was clear: find Voss's hideout, stop the raid, and end his reign of terror. But the desert was no ally, and the path ahead was as treacherous as the man they hunted. The trail led through a maze of canyons, their red walls rising like silent sentinels. Elias's canteen was half empty, the water warm and tasting of metal. He glanced at Cale, whose face was streaked with dust, his lips cracked but his expression unyielding. "You ever think about leaving this place?" Elias asked, his voice hoarse. "Findin' somewhere the sun don't try to kill you." Cale's eyes flickered with a wry smile. "This is our land, Kane. The sun, the stone, the dust, it's in our blood. Where would we go?" Elias grunted, his gaze drifting to the horizon. He'd asked himself the same question for years, since the fire that took Sarah and Jonah. The ranch was all he had, a tether to a life he could barely remember. "Someplace green," he said finally. "Someplace quiet." Cale nodded, but his silence spoke of a man who knew no such place existed for them. They rode on, the only sounds the creak of leather and the distant cry of a vulture circling above. By noon the heat was unbearable, the air shimmering with mirages that teased of water where none existed. Elias's head throbbed, his vision blurring at the edges. He reached for his canteen, but Cale's hand shot out, stopping him. "Save it," Cale said. "There's a spring ahead, if we make it." "If?" Elias raised an eyebrow, but Cale's grim expression silenced any retort. The warrior pointed to a narrow pass between two towering cliffs, its shadows promising relief but hiding threats. Elias tightened his grip on the reins, his Colt a familiar weight at his hip. The pass was a choke point, its walls closing in until the sky was a thin blue ribbon above. The air grew cooler, but the silence was oppressive, broken only by the clatter of loose stones underfoot. Elias's instincts screamed too quiet, too still. He glanced at Cale, who nodded, his spear now in hand. They dismounted, leading their horses to keep their steps soft. The pass opened into a wider canyon, its floor littered with boulders and dry brush. And then, a sound, a low hiss, sharp and sudden. Elias froze. A rattlesnake, coiled on a sun-baked rock, its tail vibrating like a warning drum. Dust snorted, rearing back, and Elias yanked her reins to steady her. The snake struck, its fangs missing his boot by inches. Cale moved like lightning, his spear pinning the creature to the ground before it could strike again. Its body writhed, then stilled. "Close," Elias muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "Too close," Cale said, his voice steady but his eyes scanning the canyon. "The desert tests us, so do our enemies." They found the spring an hour later, a trickle of water seeping from a crack in the rock. Elias knelt, filling his canteen, the coolness a fleeting mercy. Cale kept watch, his gaze fixed on the canyon's rim. "Voss's men know these trails," he said. "They'll be waiting." Elias stood, his hand brushing the stone horse in his pocket, Tala's gift. "Let 'em come," he said, though the words felt heavier than he meant. He thought of the boy, of the Yatsina rebuilding his barn, of the debt he owed them. This wasn't just about Voss anymore, it was about protecting what little good remained. Night fell as they camped in a shallow cave, the fire small to avoid detection. Cale shared dried venison, its saltiness grounding Elias's hunger. Tell me of your family, Cale said, his voice soft but probing. The ones you lost. Elias stared into the flames, the question a blade in his chest. Sarah was my wife, he said after a long pause. Kindest soul I ever knew. Jonah, our boy, was 6, loved horses, like Tala. They died in a fire, set by Voss to cover his tracks after he betrayed me. I was too late to save him. Cale's face softened, the firelight carving shadows on his features. My father died defending our village, he said. I was Tala's age. I carry his spear, but not his courage. Not yet. You've got plenty, Elias said, meeting his gaze. You're here, ain't you? Cale's smile was faint, but real. The fire crackled, a fragile bond forming in its glow. Elias felt the weight of the stone horse, a reminder of why he rode, why he fought. The attack came at dawn. A bullet ricocheted off the cave wall, showering them with dust. Elias rolled to his feet, Colt in hand, as Cale grabbed his spear. 3 of Voss's men emerged from the canyon's shadows, their rifles glinting. Kane, one shouted, his voice thick with malice. Voss says you're a dead man walkin'. Elias fired, dropping the first man before he could aim. Cale hurled his spear, catching another in the shoulder, pinning him to a boulder. The third charged, knife drawn, but Elias tackled him, the blade grazing his arm. Pain flared, hot and sharp, but he drove his fist into the man's jaw, knocking him cold. Cale retrieved his spear, his breath heavy but his eyes fierce. You're hit, Cale said, eyeing the blood-soaking Elias's sleeve. Flesh wound, Elias grunted, tying his bandana around the cut. They're scouts. Voss's hideout's close, Cale nodded, pulling a map scratched into leather from his pack. Here, he said, pointing to a cluster of cliffs a day's ride away. They hide in the old mines. We can reach it by tomorrow. Elias studied the map, the fire of vengeance flickering in his chest. But Tala's face, the Atsina's trust, the half-built barn they tempered the flame. We do this right, he said. For your people, for Red Hollow. Cale clasped his shoulder, a silent agreement. They mounted their horses, the canyon stretching before them, its shadows hiding Voss's lair. The desert tested them, but so did their own hearts. Elias felt the stone horse in his pocket, its weight a promise to Tala, to Cale, to himself. The ride was long, but the end was near. The desert night was a shroud, heavy with the scent of dust and danger. Elias Kane crouched behind a jagged boulder, his Colt revolver cold in his hand, its weight a steady anchor against the chaos to come. Beside him, Cale, the Atsina warrior, gripped his spear, his eyes glinting like polished obsidian in the faint moonlight. The old mines loomed ahead, a labyrinth of crumbling tunnels carved into the red cliffs, their entrances yawning like the mouths of forgotten gods. Caleb Voss's hideout was here, a den of vipers plotting to burn Red Hollow to ash. Elias's heart pounded, not with fear, but with a fire that had smoldered for a decade, a fire named vengeance. The journey through the canyon had forged a bond between Elias and Cale, tempered by shared hardship and whispered truths. Now, as they crept toward the mines, that bond was their strength. The air was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant crackle of a campfire and the low murmur of Voss's men. Elias counted 6 shadows moving in the glow, their rifles slung carelessly, unaware of the storm approaching. He glanced at Cale, who nodded, his face set with the resolve of a man who'd seen too much loss to falter now. We hit fast, Elias whispered, his voice a low growl. Take out the guards, find Voss. No mistakes. Cale's grip tightened on his spear. For Tala, for my people. Elias thought of the stone horse in his pocket, Tala's gift, and the weight of it steadied him. This wasn't just about settling scores, it was about protecting the boy, the Atsina, the fragile hope of a rebuilt barn. He gestured toward the nearest guard, a lanky man leaning against a crate, his cigarette a glowing beacon in the dark. Elias moved like a shadow, his boots silent on the sand. A quick strike with the butt of his Colt sent the man crumpling without a sound. Cale dispatched another with a swift jab of his spear, the guard slumping into the dirt. They slipped into the main tunnel, its walls damp and streaked with rust. The flicker of torchlight guided them deeper, the air growing heavy with the stench of sweat and gunpowder. Voices echoed ahead, Voss's drawl unmistakable, a cold, mocking cadence that clawed at Elias's memories. He saw Sarah's smile, Jonah's laughter, the flames that stole them. His hand trembled, but he forced it steady, his focus sharp as a blade. The tunnel opened into a cavern, its ceiling braced with rotting beams. Voss stood at the center, a tall figure in a black duster, his face half lit by the fire. His eyes, cold and cunning, gleamed like a coyote's. Monta. Around him, his men loaded crates with dynamite, their laughter coarse as they spoke of torching Red Hollow's bank and homes. Elias's blood boiled, but Cale's hand on his shoulder kept him grounded. "Voss," Elias called, stepping into the light, his Colt aimed at the man who'd haunted his nightmares. The cavern fell silent, Voss's men raising their rifles. Voss turned slowly, a grin spreading across his face, as if he'd been expecting this moment. "Elias Kane," he said, his voice dripping with mockery. "Still crawling out of the grave I left you in? You burned my family," Elias said, his voice steady despite the rage clawing his chest. "You burned the Atsina. Now you're planning to burn a whole town. It ends here." Voss laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "You always were soft, Kane. That's why I had to cut you loose. Your wife, your boy, they were collateral. You should have stayed dead." The words hit like a bullet. Elias's vision blurred, the cavern fading as memories flooded back Sarah's scream, Jonah's tiny hand reaching through the smoke. He raised his Colt, finger twitching on the trigger, ready to end it, but Cale's voice cut through the haze. "Elias, he wants you to lose yourself." Voss's grin widened. "Listen to your friend, Kane. Or don't. Either way, you're outnumbered." The dynamite crates loomed behind Voss, their fuses coiled like snakes. Elias saw the plan. Voss meant to bury Red Hollow in fire, just as he'd buried Elias's life. But before he could speak, a shout echoed from the tunnel. One of Voss's men charged, a torch in hand, aiming to light the fuses. Cale moved first, his spear flashing, but a gunshot rang out. Cale staggered, blood blooming on his shoulder, his spear clattering to the ground. "No!" Elias roared, firing at the shooter, dropping him instantly. He lunged to Cale's side, dragging him behind a crate as bullets ricocheted around them. Cale's face was pale, but his eyes burned with defiance. "Finish it," he gasped. "For Tala." Elias nodded, his heart a storm of guilt and fury. He rose, firing with deadly precision, each shot a reckoning. 2 more of Voss's men fell, but the others closed in, their numbers overwhelming. Elias dove for cover, his arm burning where a bullet grazed him. The cavern was a chaos of smoke and gunfire, the air thick with the promise of death. Then, a war cry pierced the din. Atsina warriors, led by Noya herself, stormed the cavern, their spears and bows turning the tide. Noya's voice rang out, fierce and unyielding, as her warriors fought with the strength of a people pushed too far. Elias seized the moment, charging Voss, who drew his own revolver with a snarl. They clashed in the center of the cavern, fists and steel blurring in the firelight. Voss was fast, his knife slashing Elias's cheek, but Elias was relentless, driven by a decade of pain. He disarmed Voss, pinning him to the ground, his Colt pressed to the outlaw's temple. "You took everything," Elias growled, his voice shaking. "Give me one reason not to end you." Voss's eyes gleamed, unafraid. "I lit the fire, Kane. I watched your house burn. Your boy cried for you, and you weren't there. Kill me, and you're still too late." The words were a blade, twisting in Elias's heart. He saw Jonah's face, heard Sarah's voice, felt the weight of his failure. His finger tightened on the trigger, vengeance a heartbeat away. But then, a faint sound broke through a child's cry, echoing from the tunnel. Tala, carried by his mother, his voice calling for Cale, for Elias. The boy's face, so like Jonah's less, anchored him. Elias's hand shook, but he lowered the gun. "You don't get to die easy," he said, his voice low. "You face justice, not me." He bound Voss's hands, dragging him to his feet as the Atsina subdued the last of his men. The dynamite crates stood untouched, their threat silenced. Noya approached, her eyes fierce but approving. "You chose well, Kane," she said. "Blood does not heal blood." Elias nodded, his chest tight with the weight of what he'd almost done. He turned to Cale, still slumped against the crate, blood pooling beneath him. "Hold on," Elias said, tearing his bandana to staunch the wound. Cale's breath was shallow, but he managed a weak smile. "You kept your soul," Cale whispered. "That's enough." The Atsina carried Cale from the cavern, their torches lighting the way. Elias followed, Voss in tow, the outlaw's silence louder than his taunts. The desert night stretched above, stars piercing the darkness like promises. The truth had burned Elias, but it hadn't broken him. The desert sky was a tapestry of stars, each a pinprick of light against the vast, unyielding dark. Elias Kane stood at the edge of his ranch, the cool night air a balm to his battered body. His arm, bandaged from the graze of a bullet, throbbed with a dull ache, but it was nothing compared to the weight in his chest. The fight in the mines had ended hours ago, yet the echoes of gunfire, of Caleb Voss's venomous words, lingered like smoke. Elias's hand rested on the stone horse in his pocket, Tala's gift, its smooth surface grounding him as he stared at the skeletal frame of the new barn, rising from the ashes of the old. Kale lay in a tent nearby, tended by the Atsina healers. The bullet had torn through his shoulder, sparing his life but stealing his strength. He would never wield a spear again, never ride into battle as he once had. The knowledge gnawed at Elias, a guilt as heavy as the loss of his own family. He had dragged Kale into this fight, and though they'd stopped Voss, the cost was carved in blood. Elias clenched his fist, the scars on his knuckles pale in the moonlight. He'd chosen justice over vengeance, but the victory felt hollow. Noya, the Atsina elder, emerged from the tent, her face etched with weariness but resolute. "He lives," she said, her voice steady. "But his path is changed, as is yours, Elias Kane." Elias met her gaze, the weight of her words settling over him. "I didn't mean for him to get hurt," he said, his voice rough. "I should have gone alone." Noya's eyes softened, though her tone held no compromise. "You carry too much, Kane. Kale chose to ride with you, as we chose to rebuild your home. We are not your burden." He looked at the barn, its timbers strong and straight, a testament to the Atsina's labor. The structure was nearly complete, its silhouette a promise of renewal against the starlit sky. "Why?" he asked, the question raw. "Why help a stranger like me?" Noya's smile was faint, like the first light of dawn. "You saved Tala. You fought for us. In our way, that makes you family." The word struck Elias like a blow, stirring memories of Sarah's laughter, Jonah's small hand in his. Family. He'd thought it lost forever, burned to ash with his past. But here, in this desolate corner of the world, the Atsina had offered him something he hadn't dared hope for: a place to belong. The next morning, the village gathered at the ranch. The Atsina warriors worked with a quiet efficiency, hammering nails, hoisting beams, their voices mingling with the rhythm of their labor. Tala ran among them, his laughter a bright note in the desert's silence. Elias joined the work, his hands finding purpose in the wood and nails, each strike of the hammer a step toward healing. The barn rose higher, its walls solid, its roof a shield against the elements. It was more than a structure, it was a bridge between his past and a future he could barely imagine. As the sun climbed, Tala approached, his small frame dwarfed by the barn's shadow. He held a carved wooden horse, its details finer than the stone one Elias carried. "For you," Tala said, his eyes bright with pride. "I made it like yours." Elias knelt, taking the carving. It was rough, but earnest, its lines echoing a toy he'd once carved for Jonah, a lifetime ago. His throat tightened, and he ruffled Tala's hair. "It's perfect, kid," he said, his voice thick. "Just like my boys." Tala beamed, running back to his mother, who watched with a quiet smile. Elias tucked the wooden horse beside the stone one, their weight a reminder of what he'd lost and what he'd found. He stood, his eyes on the barn, now complete, its wood gleaming in the sunlight. The Atsina gathered around, their faces a mix of pride and resolve. Noya stepped forward, placing a hand on the barn's doorframe. "This is yours," she said, "but it is also ours, a bond forged in fire." Elias nodded, words failing him. The barn was more than a gift. It was a symbol of trust, of a debt repaid, of a man no longer alone. He thought of Red Hollow, its streets vulnerable to men like Voss, and of the Atsina, their village still scarred by fire. He'd come to this valley to escape, to hide from his past. But the desert had other plans. Kale emerged from the tent, his arm in a sling, his face pale but determined. Elias crossed to him, guilt heavy in his steps. "I'm sorry," he said, the words inadequate. "You shouldn't have paid for my fight." Kale's smile was faint but warm. "It was our fight, Kane. You gave us justice. You gave me purpose." Elias clasped his shoulder, careful of the wound. "You're a better man than me, Kale. Then learn from me," Kale said, his eyes steady. "Stay, protect this valley. With us." The words hung in the air, a challenge and an invitation. Elias looked at the barn, at Tala playing in the dust, at Noya's unwavering gaze. He thought of Sarah and Jonah, their memory no longer a weight but a light, guiding him forward. He'd spent years running from Voss, from himself. But here, in this harsh land, he'd found something worth standing for. "I'll stay," he said, his voice firm. "For Red Hollow, for your people." Noya nodded, her eyes gleaming with approval. The Atsina began to sing, a low, resonant chant that rose with the wind, its melody weaving through the valley. It spoke of loss, of strength, of hope born from ashes. Elias listened, the sound filling the hollows of his heart. Days later, Elias rode into Red Hollow, Voss bound and slung over a horse, delivered to the sheriff's iron bars. The town buzzed with whispers, their fear of Voss replaced by a cautious hope. Elias didn't linger, he wasn't one for praise. He rode back to the ranch, the barn standing proud against the horizon. Dust snorted beneath him, her gait steady, as if she too sensed the change. That night, Elias sat by a fire, the wooden horse in his hand. The Atsina's song echoed in his memory, a reminder of the bond he'd forged. The desert was still harsh, its dangers ever present, but he was no longer a man alone. He looked to the stars, their light a promise of a new dawn, and for the first time in years, he felt something like peace. As he rose to check the barn, Tala's laughter carried on the wind, a sound that drowned out the ghosts of his past. Elias Kane, once a drifter, had found a home not in the land, but in the people who shared it. The fire that had taken so much had also given him something new, and in its glow, he would ride on.